or rational even when facing times of death. That these are all very well-educated people that can calculate the risk and really create the right in the end of the day. Look, they gave you many alternatives. Sorry, not alternatives. They gave you many parallel examples as to why people should have the choice. None of them involve an irreversible choice that cannot be reversed, and we think that is in the context of today's debate. They gave you two relatively okay examples. One are sick people. Look, sick people we're very happy to categorize out because there are no alternatives for them. However, if there are alternatives for them, we are very happy to revive them as well. In case scenarios of like housing, we say that's just not within the context of today's debate because we're talking about life and death. They talked about refugee. We say we're very happy to categorize refugee out as well. We think refugee is a perfect example because in case scenarios of refugee, you live a new life, right? And that's ultimately what the government side is trying to achieve in the end of the day. He had basically only two arguments, right? The idea of right to die. And number two, he talked about why life would still be a living hell on earth despite what Kowa said. I will disprove that. First, the right to die. We say, first of all, the reason why right to live and die is a very unique one, right? It's because the right to life is a right in which all rights stem from. And most importantly, it is irreversible under the opposition's case. That we argue individual choices ought to be limited when number one, they're relatively uninformed, and number two, they're irrational. None of the opposition case addresses these 2 points, right? Because we argue, and because these rights are so important, we are willing to play a blanket policy and assume the worst, right? And assume that you are making the wrong choice. And here's why. Because we would argue that number one, by the time when you're trying to die, the mental calculus in which you have is your personal identity and your personal morals versus the morals of the society. That the morals of the society is a social construct. And the decision in which you made at that point of a time is as a result of the social construct, right? So we argue essentially what happens is that you're not exposed to the full alternative. Because unfortunately, there are other constructs and identities out there in which you are not exposed to yet. But why are we so inclined of them being exposed to every platform before they make this choice? It's because it's a matter of life and death. But even if they're exposed with all of the platforms possible, we still argue that that's wrong. Because you will very well likely be irrational. Because the idea of rationality when it comes to life and death case scenario, a lot of people take it as an easy way out. And I'm sorry, if you only want to focus on extreme case scenarios where people have a well-educated decision that they want to die, that's fine as well. We will clash with that as well. But you can't take it, you also have to take into account that people are often, it's a sudden burst of emotion that they feel like they want to die at that moment, period of time. We think that's extremely harmful as well. There are Koreans, not trying to do racial war, but there are people out there under the status quo that's committed suicide because there's not enough selfies, right? And that is as a result of the social context in which they have. A Singaporean dude committed suicide because he watched too much porn and he feels like his penis is not big enough. Right? Right? So we argue that there's no way in which you can say that your decision is rational or not. We think that it's within the state to err on the side of caution, to assume that it's rational, to assume that you haven't been exposed to all the information. Then they say life will be hell on earth afterwards. And that leads on to my argument. But before, yes.
What does it say about your side's perception towards suicide that you consistently belittle the choice as an easy way out and moreover make fun of some people who have made this choice?
People will no longer take the easy way out because they know they have to deal with reality and they will then explore further alternatives. And that's ultimately what we want to achieve. We argue, and this is my first substantive, that our policy generates positive discussions and positive narratives within the society. Because we argue that suicide is such a unique negative experience that allows individuals to reflect what they've done. So things like support groups and online communities and social blogs, it's exactly like how alcohol addicts and sex addicts are able to create support groups. Why are these important? Because we feel like under the status quo, there are powerful narratives within the media that either informs people on how to suicide or glorify suicide in a way in soap operas where you have teenagers wanting to suicide or you have a lot of businessmen wanting to suicide within the soap opera. And people take that into consideration and decide that whenever I face a business problem, I want to suicide, right? And we argue that's something that's negative. right? Because they never segregated the amount that the types of people that want suicide. We argue there's 3 types. Number 1, there are people that simply just want to get attention, right? And under our proposal, we take that death hostage away from them and force them to deal with reality. But number 2, people are suiciding simply because they're not gaining exposure. And we argue, under our proposal, you are able to gain that exposure. So for instance, if a calculated businessman decides to suicide because he thinks he's going to get fired, in the wake of revival, he's able to experience the world where he is already fired and take that unique experience and allow him to rethink again. We think that's very, very important, right? But we also argue, essentially what happens is when you have these kind of online chat communities and you have people sharing ideas as to why this is right or wrong, then you have narratives being generated out. You put them on spotlight. We will also concede to the fact that there might be negative narratives where people say, crap, they should have revived me. Maybe I should have died. And we argue that's a good thing because you offer discussions, right? And fortunately, the general population in the society have an average reasonably good moral, right? That an average reasonable person will talk people out of suicide without wanting to know exactly what happened. But exactly what our proposal does, and this counters your second argument, is that essentially what happens is you allow people and their surroundings, families, and friends to allow them to know what in the bloody world is happening. A well-calculated suicide people, the very idea of them is that they don't really tell people why in the bloody world they're dying. A lot of times it's just a piece of paper saying goodbye world, right? Essentially what our policy does is allow their surroundings to know what exactly is going on, and upon revival, allow surroundings to nurture and talk them out of suicidal. And even in cases where they're just an isolated human being, we still have psychological programs from the state and all these kind of things, right? But we further argue that the choice in which individual make is not a complete one. So say, for instance, if I made the choice to kill myself, and as a result, the state sees that the welfare program is not good enough and started changing the welfare program. The problem with the opposition's case is I have already died and I'm no longer able to enjoy that choice in the end of the day. So I essentially just become a statistic. And we argue that's something that liberal democracies ought not to have. We are very, very proud to propose.